Welcome to the Together for Good podcast, a podcast specifically designed to inspire, challenge, and uplift you during your daily walk of faith. Friends, we are continuing on our journey through Lent together, and here on the podcast, that means that I have another Change in Perspective episode for you. This week, Pastor Gary is coming on to offer a Bible study for all of us to listen along with, and what Pastor Gary is doing is he's looking at Psalm 22. Now, that might not seem significant. You might think to yourself, I know about Psalm 23. What's Psalm 22? Psalm 22 includes a whole bunch of different phrases that Jesus utters while on the cross. And so Pastor Gary is going to talk to us about the significance of the things that Jesus said and the particular parts of Psalm 22 that we will encounter again on Good Friday in just a short amount of time here. So as always, thanks for listening to the podcast, for sharing it with family and friends. But now I turn the mic over to Pastor Gary. He'll lead you through the rest as he gives us a change in perspective on Psalm 22.
Hello, people of Bethany Lutheran Church. Thanks for joining me on this podcast. As I record this, it is March of 2023, and we're in the middle of a Lenten series on change of perspective. So today I'm going to be looking at the potential change of perspective concerning Jesus' words from the cross, specifically those words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, many of you know this is in a sense, a direct quote from verse 1 of Psalm 22, which does read, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, as we look at this, there are a couple of ways we can look at Jesus' words on the cross, maybe multiple ways, but two that tend to be primarily spoken about. One is that it's possible that Jesus was simply using the Psalms as a way of relaying the anguish that he felt at that moment. Quoting Psalms to relay a particularly emotion that we have is certainly something that is quite common for us today and may have been quite common for people in Jesus' day. We will hear people say, I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where is my help to come, when they might be feeling like they're in despair. Of course, Psalm 23 is often quoted in many different ways. Even there, when people might say, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but I fear no evil. That can certainly be a part of how people would choose to express a deep emotion that they might be having. But now in Psalm 22, I want to look at what was potentially Jesus conjuring up, not just for himself, but maybe what was Jesus conjuring up for the people who were looking on, who would have been able to hear his words at this point. To do that, I'm going to be looking at Psalm 22, and then the crucifixion account from Matthew. In the year 2023, Matthew is the primary gospel that we're hearing throughout the year, so rather than sort of compiling a mass story from all four Gospels, I'm simply going to rely on the crucifixion story that we have from Matthew chapter 27. And it is only in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark that we hear these words of Jesus from the cross. We hear them as Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which then Matthew translates for us, my God, why have you forsaken me? And again, that coming directly from the first verse of Psalm 22. But as we consider that, there are so many other parallels between Psalm 22 and the crucifixion story. They don't line up particularly chronologically between Psalm and Matthew 27. We have to jump around a little bit to find out where all of the parallels are. But the parallels are so striking that they really can't be ignored. To do this, I'm going to be making my way through Psalm 22, and at points finding where the parallels lie in the crucifixion story in the Gospel of Matthew. Well, after in Psalm 22, we hear, my God, why have you forsaken me? It goes on to say, why so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. This could even be going back to considering the previous night when Jesus was arrested, put into jail, and found no rest clearly through that evening. But we'll go on. Verse 3, yet you are the Holy One enthroned upon the praises of Israel. Our ancestors put their trust in you. They trusted and you rescued them. Could Jesus have been using that first verse of Psalm 22 to already put some foreshadowing for those who would know that psalm to understand what he was doing? We hear the psalmist say, they cried out to you and were delivered. To do that, we almost have to jump to the very end of the crucifixion story, when we would hear at the end of it that the tombs were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. We might get an indication from there that that was playing back to understanding what it means to be completely delivered, even delivered from death, as that would be. Verse 6, we hear from the psalmist, but as for me, I am a worm and not human, scorned by all and despised by the people. We don't have to look very far at all in Matthew's gospel to hear time and again. Verse 30, they spat on Jesus and took the reed and struck him on the head. We hear as we go along, those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads. This sense of all who see me laugh to scorn, they curl their lips, they shake their heads, almost seems to be directly what Matthew was saying as he says, those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads. Now the psalmist goes on to say, trust in the Lord, let the Lord deliver. Let God rescue him if God so delights in him. And so we hear once again that as Jesus is on the cross and as he cries out, it says one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. That'll come up a little later. But another one says, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. So there again, from verse 4, trust in the Lord, let God deliver him. Let God rescue him if God so delights. And somebody saying, whoa, let's wait and see if this will actually happen. As we read on in the psalm to look for these parallels, verse 9, yet you are the one who drew me forth from the womb and kept me safe on my mother's breast. I have been entrusted to you ever since I was born. And as we look at that, we would hear that the people, even as they were throwing contempt at Jesus when he was on the cross, one of them said, let's wait and see if God will deliver him now, again bringing up that same passage that we heard earlier. But then he goes on to say, the passerby, for he said, I am God's son. And so as we hear a psalmist say, I've been entrusted to you ever since I was born. You were my God when I was still in my mother's womb. To then come back and throw those words almost back at Jesus on the cross, saying he said he was God's son. In the midst of the taunting then, it goes on to say that the bandits who were crucified with Jesus also taunted him in the same way. The sense of taunting that comes from Psalm 22 and the way that Matthew continues to bring that up at several points in the crucifixion story are certainly incredible parallels there. We hear then again from the psalmist, be not far from me, again as the psalmist would be crying out to God, be not far from me, for trouble is there, then there is no one to help. We saw that even as Pilate was dealing with Jesus in Matthew 27, verse 24, so when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, he washed his hands before the crowd. Almost a parallel back to when we would read in that psalmist, there is no one to help me. The psalmist goes on to say, many young bulls encircle me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. And shortly after Pilate said that he could do nothing, we hear that they took Jesus to the governor's headquarters, and there they gathered the whole cohort around him. And so that again is that sense of being surrounded, the parallels that come through. I jumped a little bit ahead as I was getting to that point of the person saying, let's wait and not do anything to see if God will deliver him, because the psalmist in the end of verse or middle of verse 15 says, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. My tongue almost stuck there just trying to tell you, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. And that's why we had one of the passerbyers run and get a sponge filled with wine and put it on a stick to give it to him to drink, almost fulfilling that sense of Jesus' thirst at that moment as a part of all of that. Verse 16 says of Psalm 22, packs of dogs close me in, a band of evildoers circles round me. We heard all of that, but then this phrase, they pierce my hands and my feet. Now, we don't get that specific description in Matthew's gospel, but we do simply hear, and when they had crucified him. And of course, part of the crucifixion experience would have been having those nails driven through your hand or maybe at your wrist, and then even through your feet as a way of affixing a person to the cross. And so when we hear that from Psalm 22, they pierce my hands and feet, all we would have to hear from there is that Jesus was crucified to know that that was coming through. Verse 17, the psalmist says, I can count all my bones while they stare and gloat at me. And then verse 18, they divide my garments among them. For my clothing they cast lots. Back to Matthew's gospel, we heard, and when they had crucified him, it goes on to say, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. And you get now that parallel of saying what was happening here. It would be one thing if Jesus himself were trying to conjure up visions of Psalm 22 for his passerbyers, but I have a hard time believing that the Roman soldiers would have said, hey, in the psalm it says that we cast lots and divided his clothing. We should do that now. I really think that there's something about the prophetic nature of Psalm 22 that simply seems to carry through in the midst of all of this. At that point, some of the parallels nearly come to an end. We can go back and catch a few things from Matthew's gospel, like the passerbyers spat on Jesus, took the reed and struck him on the head, as we hear again those words about surrounding him, no one there to help him. They laugh at me to scorn. And then also hearing the voice of Jesus crying out in the midst of that. You know, they cried out and you were delivered. And we hear about 3:00, Jesus cried with a loud voice, which is where he said that line of verse 1, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And again in Matthew's gospel, Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. And we seem to get toward the end of Psalm 22 at verse 29. Indeed, all who sleep in the earth shall bow down and worship. All who go down to the dust, though they be dead, shall kneel to the Lord. And so when we hear Jesus breathing his last with a very loud cry, that's when we get that sense about the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Matthew gives us great detail here as he says, after the resurrection, they came out of their tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. And then finally, we might say at the end of Psalm 22 at verse 31, they shall proclaim God's deliverance to a people yet unborn, saying to them, the Lord has acted. We might not really know who they is according to the psalmist, but this is what we hear from Matthew after the crucifixion, after Jesus' death. We hear this in verse 54. Now when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, truly this man was God's son. Again, the psalmist said, they shall proclaim God's deliverance to a people yet unborn, saying to them, the Lord has acted. Now, if we look at those parallels from Psalm 22 and Matthew 27, we might say, was Matthew simply trying to record in his gospel all of these parallels that we should be trying to find, even just from one psalm. And I'm not even going to get into the parallels that we would get into if we looked at some of the important passages from Isaiah, but simply trusting in Psalm 22 or looking at that specifically because of Jesus' words from the cross. What we do hear from the psalmist at the beginning is it does feel like there's an incredible amount of despair coming. And clearly, Jesus wanted to maybe give both himself, but maybe even for those who could hear it, a sense that the despair that he was feeling was very real. Even the desperation of feeling separated from God at this point was certainly very real. But I would have to say that I've always looked at this feeling like Jesus would quote something to give us a little bit of an indication of what he understood happening even in that moment. So he knows even in the midst of the greatest despair that he may have felt throughout his entire life, that there was still something kind of lurking in the background, still a message that he was hoping to deliver that was beyond despair for the disciples, for the women also who were gathered there. And so as the parallels in the front part of that psalm greatly parallel the crucifixion story that we've heard, at verse 19, it feels that Jesus, by using Psalm 22, lets people know that there can be a turning point here. This is what we heard in Psalm 19 from the psalmist, or verse 19 from the psalmist. But you, O Lord, be not far away. O my help, hasten to my aid. Deliver me from the sword, my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild bulls. You have rescued me. And then, verse 22, I will declare your name to my people. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. Jesus would not have another chance to be in a synagogue or in an assembly of the person, but it feels like he's using this moment to say that in the midst of the greatest despair he could possibly feel, he will not give up on praising what it is that he knows God can and will do. And I believe that if Jesus would be saying that for himself, Jesus would also be trying to translate that same message to us. As we hear the psalmist go on from here, we hear that there's an avenue of such tremendous hope that comes through. We hear the poor shall eat and be satisfied. Let those who seek the Lord give praise. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations shall bow before God, for dominion belongs to the Lord who rules over the nations. When I hear the way the psalmist ends this psalm, when I hear the way Matthew plays out still the crucifixion story, that's what I think is really maybe the most important thing here. This is all happening in the crucifixion story. Some of it, we have to wait for the resurrection story to maybe get its fullness for us. But I think Jesus is already trying to create that sense of fullness even at crucifixion, let alone seeing what the resurrection will bring from it. So maybe it's a new perspective to hear and to understand what it is that Jesus might have been trying to convey. As I said, it's certainly possible that Jesus was just in the midst of tremendous anguish and quoting a psalm to try to give a clue, to let the hearers know that the way that you convey incredible sorrow and despair is through quoting Scripture. That's certainly possible. But I also think it's quite possible that Jesus was quoting Scripture almost as a way of throwing it at the Romans. For they would want to have heard, my God, why have you forsaken me? And let it end there. But the psalmist didn't let it end there. And actually, neither did Jesus. The way that we continue to see the life of Jesus pointing us toward a God who might come to us in our moment of greatest despair, but that's the time when God might bring the greatest comfort. The very presence of God becomes its strongest, because it's at those moments that we find out that the strength of God can overpower any strength that evil could put upon us. That when we turn our lives over to God, we'll understand that God will always be there. And then we realize that from us, that part of our future, even when we find ourselves in despair, will be a time when we're able to say, "From you comes my praise in the great assembly. I will perform my vows in the sight of those who fear the Lord." I think that Jesus was giving us an indication of the ever-present strength that God wants us to have. If we can hear that from Jesus' most intense suffering on the cross, I hope it's something that we can put into practice in our own lives as well. Maybe that's just one new perspective on this one phrase from Jesus on the cross. There are certainly many more. We have 7 powerful phrases that Jesus uttered from the cross. I just think this one, with the parallels of Psalm 22 and the crucifixion story, might bring us new insight into what Jesus was trying to teach us at that moment as well. Well, thanks for joining me on this Together for Good podcast. I look forward to being with you again in the future.